Alrighty. Hello, everyone. We thank you so much for joining this webinar on mergers, reorganization in hard times, thinking about nonprofits. And we are just going to wait a couple of minutes for people to join, and then we will get started. So let's give it another minute or two. Thank you.
Oh, looks like Michael's here.
Hey, how you doing, everybody?
Hi, good to see you.
I was an ugly flyer.
It's okay.
You know those guys who
Just
run
like
to the
let
front of
me
the
off the
plane?
plane. Yeah, exactly. Well, good
Totally.
to see you. I'm glad you
Yeah,
made it.
yeah. Thank you. Yep. And the connection looks all right, right? Good.
You look fine.
Yes, excellent.
Okay,
Well,
great.
I was
Thanks.
just about to get this thing started. We have a good number of participants, and I think people will continue to filter in as in the next couple of minutes, but I can start. So thank you everyone for joining. My name is Asha Brundage-Moore, and I'm the director of the Collaborative Clinic for Nonprofit Viability within the Yale Center for Environmental Justice. We are so happy for you to join us here today for this webinar on, called Nonprofit Survival Strategy, Mergers, Reorganizations in Hard Times, and thinking about what it means for nonprofits to survive and secure their longevity. This is an important topic given the changes that are happening around funding, rhetoric, and support for nonprofits across the board. And as part of both the Center for Environmental Justice and the Collaborative Clinic's mission to share this information about how organizations can secure themselves and prepare for the future. Please look out for our next webinar on May 7th on nonprofits in an election year. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. We have Michael Glubter, who is the Center for Environmental Justice Executive Director. He's going to moderate our discussion with our very distinguished guests. And Michael himself brings decades of experience in government and academia, but also in nonprofits. So he can speak from experience as going through some of these mergers and reorganizations in hard times past and what they say about the future. We also have Victoria Bjorklund, who is the retired partner and founder of the tax exempt organizations or of the exempt organizations group at Simpson Thacher LLP. She is one of the leading experts in nonprofit law, with decades of experience advising nonprofits, foundations, boards of governments on compliance, restructuring, and mergers. She brings a really excellent combination of her years of experience and deep technical expertise with practical judgment and a really human angle of thinking about how to go through these really challenging experiences for an organization. We're delighted to have her here with us today, and I'll let you take it away, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you, Asha. Really appreciate it. And Victoria, thank you so much for joining us today. We're gonna talk. I think Victoria, as everyone knows, the collaborative clinic for nonprofit viability is primarily a legal clinic focused on keeping the environmental justice community and indigenous organizations healthy in tough times. And Victoria is an amazing expert in a critical issue in terms of organizational survival and adaptation. So I'm going to hand it to her to talk quite a bit about the legalities, the technicalities, but also her experience in mergers and acquisitions. And then we'll have a little bit of a dialogue and tell some stories because those are pretty central to the issues of mergers. Of what are the stories we tell each other, and how do we merge them when we become new organizations? How do we think about our identities, who we are, what our missions are? And those end up overlapping sometimes with creativity in the legal approaches. But I just, from years of experience, both having managed two major nonprofit mergers myself and having been in the private sector with startup acquisitions, some sense of sort of the more personal dimensions that tend to then spill into the legal and organizational choices we have to make. So that's some of the dialogue we'll have in this hour. And with that, I'll hand it over to Victoria to tell us, to talk to us about an in-depth view of how to think about this stuff. So thank
Well,
you.
thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I want you to know I'm going to give you at least 8 examples later, as Michael said, of restructurings that did work and didn't work. And I think that we learn a lot by looking at how other situations evolved, happened, and did or did not succeed. So this area, I just want to say, I've been practicing law for about 50 years in the nonprofit area. I also taught for 9 years at Harvard Law School, and I worked as an administrator at a university before going to law school. And I want to say I have never seen a harder time in the past 50 years for nonprofits than the last 2 years, particularly the last 1.5 years. There are so many changes that are impacting nonprofits in very difficult ways that I think we have never seen a time in the past 50 years where collaborations and possible restructurings are going to be more important than ever for the survival of particularly the environmental sector. We have a hostile environment in the EPA, for example. We have lost a lot of funding in this field. In addition, we have activists who are urging wealthy individuals not to be giving to philanthropy, but instead to be either focusing on for-profit job creation or giving to PACs, and therefore draining funds that would typically have come to nonprofits into other areas, including election advocacy and politicking, which of course 501c3 entities cannot participate in. In addition, we've seen changes in the tax law, the law that I call the big ugly bill, not the big beautiful bill, changed who can claim tax deductions and for how much. And in many cases, it has cut off corporate philanthropic funding, which may have been a source of funding for your organizations in the past. In addition, we have seen attacks on 501c3 organizations via executive orders, the EEOC, and other federal agencies. And for example, we just saw the new indictment 2 days ago against the Southern Poverty Law Center. So we're seeing the federal government, in a way, weaponized against nonprofits that I have never seen. In addition, the IRS, which is the overseer of the nonprofit world from the federal level, has been decimated in its EO division, the Exempt Organizations Division. There are now selective audits going on against charities that have been chosen possibly for their viewpoints or the kind of work they do, rather than for the typical legal reasons that, let's say, 20 years ago we would see, such as questions on their Form 990 filings about what their activities are, or various compensation arrangements. So, what does that have to do with what we're talking about today? That means that many organizations are having to deal with questions about their funding streams, their efficiencies, their futures. And it's important, as their boards consider strategic options, that they consider the different kinds of mergers or reaffiliations or other kinds of combinations that they might do. Now, who is involved in these kinds of discussions? It's typically going to start with members or the board, and it's important to know whether your organization is or is not a member organization. Members are analogous to shareholders in the for-profit world. In New York State, where I am licensed to practice, I practice in New York and Delaware. But until the year 1970, every nonprofit had to be a membership organization. And those members voted to elect the board. And if there was going to be a merger or a structural change or sale of substantially all assets, those members had to be involved and had to approve. So you need to know what is your governing state law, and you need to know whether you are a member or a non-member organization. A non-member organization, as most organizations have become. In fact, in the 80s, I did a lot of work, including for the Yale Alumni Association of New York, to convert them from a membership association to a non-member organization where the board of directors elects its own successors. So you need to know who the parties are, who are the decision makers, and you need to know what your governing law is. Why does that matter so much? Because mergers, consolidations, Cypre doctrine, dissolutions are all governed by state law, not by federal law. They're reported on the 990 to the federal government, but it's the state law that governs. And in New York State, the Attorney General is very active. In Delaware, the Attorney General is not very active. In fact, Delaware doesn't even have a not-for-profit corporation law. You're under the regular business corporation law there. And Connecticut does not have a particularly activist Attorney General's office. And what we have seen also is that in recent years, some bad nonprofits have moved to states with low oversight. And all they need is a scandal. There are some big scandals in Texas. Texas now has state oversight of nonprofits. So you need to know what your governing law is. Are you a corporation or a trust? That is going to be a critical question. Trusts are much more complicated to deal with. And I want to point out that it's better to think about these things early rather than when you're in dire straits. And this is a very emotional subject. It's very emotional because we are all attached to our organizations. We are attached to our leadership teams. We are attached to our employees. We're attached to our mission. And the thought that we might change any of those components is very difficult. I will point out that the emotional features are quite different in the nonprofit space and more intense in the nonprofit space than they are in for-profits. In the for-profit world, where the purpose, the mission of the corporation is to create profits for shareholders, we do not have the profit structure or the profit motivation that incentivizes mergers to save costs. In the nonprofit world, it is much more likely that a merger or other combination will take place to increase efficiencies, to empower strategic options that may not be present in a single organization, and to do much more mission-driven work. And therefore, we have seen over the decades that actually in nonprofit mergers, there's much less employment loss, and many more of the people involved stay involved, perhaps in new roles in the combined organization. So do not let for-profit mergers that you read about be your guide when you think about nonprofit mergers. So what do you have to focus on first? Of course, you have to look at your assets. What are your strengths? What's your human capital? Your board, is it a strong board? Is it functioning well? Your executive capacity, is it functioning as well as it should be? What about your programs? Are they well funded, or are others doing similar work that's better funded than yours? Are your assets restricted or unrestricted? If they have donor restrictions, you're going to have to follow through with those donor restrictions on any actions you take. One of the most important assets that a nonprofit has is its mailing list, its donor base. What do those look like for you? And what other intellectual property do you have, your organization, name, your logo, your slogan. It's amazing how valuable slogans can be and how often they have not been properly protected. You may know the slogan, "A mind is a terrible thing to waste." That would be an example of a very valuable slogan. And then we have real estate assets, which you may or may not have. But I mentioned that that's really important. Those can be assets or those can be liabilities. And you may have leases, you may have owned real property, you may have employment contracts, you may have employment taxes due. Those are critical to address. They cannot be pushed to the side. And you may have other debts that will have to be addressed. And dealing with debt is one of the most important factors that we see here. I also want to mention to you that there are parties out there who can help you. You are talking to people at a network and a clinic that are very knowledgeable and can provide you with guidance and advice. In addition, I want to mention to you that there are organizations. One of them is Sea Change Capital Partners, SEACHANGE, and they manage the New York Mergers and Collaborations Fund. I helped set up Sea Change's early operations, and I have had merger clients, smaller nonprofits, where Sea Change has actually paid their legal fees to get a merger or a collaboration done. So they might be someone to look into. They also manage the Lodestar Foundation, which also helps with expenses. And many other organizations, Bridgespan Consulting Group for nonprofits offers some grants for mergers. NICON, the New York Organization of Nonprofits, also offers help in nonprofits and strategic sustainability. So you can look to community foundations in your state and others to see if there would be help, first in imagining what you might need or want, and second in helping you figure out how you can pay for this if you need to pay for lawyers, accountants, or others. So I also do not want to go into our options until I mention to you that under state law, it is standard for either or both of the Attorney General or your state courts to manage, approve, oversee the nonprofit change that you are contemplating. In New York, they are very active, both the court and the Attorney General's office. And the standard that they apply is that the combination, whatever form it takes, will have, quote, the absence of adverse effect. Absence of adverse effect. So that means that it will be beneficial in whatever form it takes, and they can get very involved. And a merger, typically, if it's very well planned out and thought, is going to take a minimum of 3 to 4 months, and complex ones or ones that are questioned or ones where there's judicial intervention can take years. I'm talking 6 to 8 years in my experience. So, Michael, shall we go into discussion of different kinds of options now? You're muted.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, absolutely. Go for it. Let's talk about
Okay,
that.
so as we were planning, I identified 6 options that are the main ones that I have seen in my experience. So the first option is probably the most common, and I call it merger of weaker B into stronger A, with A the survivor taking the assets and liabilities of weaker B. Now, remember I talked about emotion? This is a very emotional thing because no nonprofit wants to see itself as the weaker nonprofit. But let's face it, there are times when an organization is struggling to survive, and yet it has very valuable and important programs. And those programs should be carried on by another organization. So here, let me give you an example of one that worked and one that didn't work. So in 2013, the organization RARE and the organization, the Nature Conservancy, announced that they were going to merge RARE, a smaller environmental activist community engagement entity, into the Nature Conservancy to boost the Nature Conservancy's community engagement globally, because the Pride campaigns and the other community engagements that RARE did were so excellent that the Nature Conservancy said, why should we duplicate this? Let's be efficient and we'll have RARE merge into us. Well, several years passed and they had many fruitful discussions, but in the end, they did not merge. They worked in collaboration, but they didn't merge. So that would be one example. We don't really know what the
Victoria,
final
did
result.
you
Yeah,
did you work on that one yourself?
I did not, but I watched it with great interest.
Oh, okay.
And I was very
Yes. Yeah, it
interested.
was
And
legendary.
yeah, and there's been a lot of discussion, and they've published a paper. Why did we announce it before we finalized it? And the answer that they gave was when
Mm.
we got into it, it proved to be more complex than we had realized. So there's the emotional factor. And there's the question about liabilities, because in this kind of merger, a regular traditional merger, whatever liabilities the entity being merged into the survivor has, they go into the survivor. And that can require a whole bunch of thinking like, wow, are there potential liabilities we don't know about? Should we buy special insurance to cover our directors and officers? What if employees show up and there are employment claims? So that would be an example of the kind of things that sometimes people realize later. But it's really important for organizations to be upfront about the liabilities they are carrying and potentially bringing over. Uh, and also, there are questions about what roles are there? Again, the emotional piece. What about our executive director? What role will that person have? What about our board members? What roles will those people have? Are we merging the boards? Or are we only getting 2 seats? Those are the kinds of things that I have seen derail these regular standard mergers. Let me give you an example of a more recent
Victoria, if I could
success.
give a little
Yeah,
color in the, if I could give a,
sure.
Victoria, can I give a little color on the rare one? I have some sense of what happened on the inside there. At a high level, one of the really interesting things was that Rare's excellence was really in communications, as you were sort of saying. They were just
Yes,
incredibly good at reaching people, and framing the issues they worked on, in their case, endangered species, with tremendously powerfully. At the same time, TNC was a much older, much larger organization with its own
much
brand.
larger.
And I think some of the issue was that, right, some of the issue was that Rare was so kind of quote unquote, Rare's brand still was so kind of hot among people in the field because that's what they do, right? They get you to know what they're working on really well. And I think that was part of the tension in that merger was that they were trying to acquire that heat, that juice that Rare had with communications, but TNC was its own major brand, and that there was fear of dilution, on kind of both sides, of the brands, and so which is sort of almost in some sense a personality thing, but they couldn't quite figure out how to transfer the hotness from smaller group to kind of this bigger group and have people feel like they still could be who they were. That was part of what was happening there. Yeah,
Absolutely. And that is not an
but go ahead.
unusual
Yeah, please.
outcome. So I want to mention a successful one with smaller
Yeah.
organizations. In 2021, Lake George Association, Lake George is in upstate New York, and the Fund for Lake George merged with the Lake George Association being the survivor. The Lake George Association had really been a community group that engaged the community about issues involving the water quality, et cetera, in Lake George. And the fund was very scientifically driven, worrying about algae blooms and the like. But what I found very interesting about this successful merger, again, the association was the survivor, but the chairman of the board of the fund became the chairman of the board of the association, and the executive director of the fund became the executive director of the association, but all of the membership of the association continued with the new merged activities, which included more of the community awareness from the Survivor Corporation and the science-driven research from the fund. That's an example of a successful, efficient, and appropriate merger of two environmentally important groups, which really, they are the main drivers of activity in protecting Lake George. So that would show you an example. I don't know if I would necessarily say the association was stronger, but it had a much bigger group behind it. That label, stronger and weaker, is one that often the lawyers have to avoid. So the next option would be what we would call the merger of equals, or A and B merge into a new co. You create a new corporation and they both merge up into it. This is also called a consolidation. I would like to mention the biggest consolidation that I ever worked on was in it finally happened January 1st of 1998. It was the $2 billion consolidation of New York Hospital and Presbyterian Hospital. Incredibly complicated consolidation. New Presbyterian Hospital had been founded in 1855 to take care of Civil War orphans. New York Hospital was chartered by King George in the 1770s, before the date of the American Revolution, so they didn't even have a certificate of incorporation. They had a charter from the King of England. And we were instructed to get them so married that they could never separate. And because of that, that is now considered the most successful large merger ever to occur in the hospital field. They were seeking efficiencies and to reduce costs. And they were $2 billion in value at the time in 1998, and they are now worth more than $10 billion. So it has been very successful. And it was a full asset merger, which is the reason it was much more successful than most other big medical mergers. But I will tell you, one of the things that we did while we merged the hospitals into NewCo, we kept the medical schools separate and in partnership. So I'm just pointing out to you, you have to look at all the assets and activities of an entity, and you can't treat all of them necessarily the same way. In addition, we had a lot, millions of dollars worth of endowed bed funds from the 1800s, where if your servant got sick in your house, you didn't want them sick in your house, so there was an endowed bed for your household at a hospital. And we had to go through all of those funds with the New York State Attorney General. I know there were more than 700 of them, and they looked at every single one. And we did a cypre being Anglo-Norman for as nearly as possible. And that money was changed from being endowed beds to being clinics in the communities where people could go if they were unwell and get clinic care at reduced cost in their communities. So that would be an example where you have equals. And believe me, these two hospitals consider themselves equals, despite their various assets and when they were formed and who they were formed by and their storied histories, but into a NewCo structure. And that took several years, and it had deep involvement of courts and the Attorney General. And we even had to go to the federal government to get antitrust clearance because they were such important operators. The third option, so we've talked about merger of weaker B into stronger A. We've talked about the merger of equals and consolidation into NewCo. The third option is that weaker B transfers its stronger programs and their associated funding to a stronger A, and then weaker B dissolves. So this really is used where you have liability anxiety about the weaker entity, but you've got important programs that you want to have continue. I'm not going to name the organization, but we were brought in for an organization that had excellent funded programs for helping poor people upgrade their homes, particularly by replacing their windows with better weather treatment windows. And they had funding for that. But the organization had been poorly managed, and they had issues with terrible liabilities for not having properly paid their employment taxes. So nobody wanted to touch them or take them in merger because they couldn't quantify how much they owed the federal government for unpaid taxes. Employment taxes are like a trust fund on your assets. So we worked with the Attorney General and the courts in New York, and we took the programs, the employees, and the funding, government funding and private funding, for the successful environmental renewal program, and another organization took that on. And we saved the program and we saved the jobs, but it did mean that the organization then had to deal with its liabilities and dissolve. So that again is an approach that is used, especially if you have worries about liabilities.
Victoria, can we
Option,
stick with
yeah,
that one? Can we stick
sure.
with that one for a second, right? So basically, if you're a small grassroots organization who's, basically had, as so many have recently, serious funding challenges, right? And some of those do play out in terms of payroll tax liability, in terms of employment liabilities for vacation time, or, some of our organizations, people work so hard and accrue long vacation times, and that can be a liability on the books. Like, oh, wait, we're going to move the employees, but we got to move a year of vacation, or 15 weeks of vacation for somebody over with it as well, which you don't want people to lose, obviously. But I think if you're in a really deep hole as an organization, thinking about it's functionally like a form of there are a lot. It's not, you may not always call it this, but it's like a form of bankruptcy for an organization. It's a way to kind of, if you're able to transfer, the way Victoria mentioned it, the assets, the programs, even the employees, you can leave in the original shell the liabilities that had been accrued that may be keeping a lot of organizations up late at night right now, and kind of release them into kind of a more bankruptcy kind of framework for the shell that's remaining, enable the programs to move forward without the overhang of a history that may have been severely impacted by the switches and cuts that have happened in the last couple of years. It doesn't feel good for anybody to think about how to kind of dump liabilities in that way. But if your mission's really important, and our sector has less resources for managing those kind of liabilities. By the way, it's really, I think, important to recognize in the not-for-profit sector, we're missing two pillars of corporate success. One is intellectual property. When you think about something like a company like Coca-Cola, 80% of what Coca-Cola is worth is it's in its brand and its people, and we don't get to exploit that as nonprofits. We don't get to float shares or have stock valuations or things like that. So we have a lot less assets. We have a lot less ways of using the amazingness of our nonprofits to to keep the business going. We are not able to take debt on future revenue in most cases either, for example. So debt and equity are tools that nonprofit organizations don't have, that make us very different in terms of our ability to be resilient compared to private sector companies. So don't turn away from the other tools that are available for corporate survival or corporate management, that are available to us, like the equivalent of kind of ways of walking away from certain kinds of debt or liabilities through bankruptcy or other kinds of adjustments like the ones Victoria just described. Nobody wants to do that necessarily, but if you're not, everybody wants to be responsible with respect to the obligations they have. But if there are ways to keep the mission going and leave some of the stuff that's really breaking you down behind, this is one of the ways to think about that. Back to you,
And let me
Victoria.
tell you what the happy ending was to this. The After the programs were transferred, the remaining liabilities, the board worked together and raised the money and paid off the liabilities. So the organization was actually able to dissolve, and we were brought in actually and paid by an organization, a for-profit corporation, where a board member had been involved. And we were brought in to make sure that we got the transaction done And they raised the money for the liabilities we identified, and we had a clean dissolution at the end. So it was actually very happy. Then 2 years and 9 months later, there's a 3-year statute of limitations for audit by the IRS. The IRS turned up and they wanted to do a complete audit of the last 3 years of the organization. And we were brought in by the for-profit corporation that had engaged us, and we managed the audit. No change audit, everything was done beautifully, and that closed the books and closed the audit. I have never had a closed entity audited except in that case, but we had a happy ending. So the next option I want to talk about is where
But
weaker
Victoria, one thing,
B,
just folks should
yeah,
start loading questions in the Q&A now because we're going to move to Q&A in about 5 to 7 minutes. So please,
yep,
we have
5 minutes,
one
right.
already, but keep going, everybody. Go for
Okay, so option 4, weaker B dissolves. And in its plan of dissolution, which the board passes, assets are identified to be sent out to other organizations as dissolution distributions. The leading case in New York is unfortunately a case that my firm handled, Multiple Sclerosis Service Organization of New York. It's an 1986 case where the board of the Multiple Sclerosis Service Organization, which provided recreation and social service activities to patients, was proceeding in a traditional way of dissolution, and it identified other 501c3 organizations to receive its programs and assets and funding. However, to their surprise, the National Multiple Sclerosis Organization intervened and argued that no, the money should not go to the entities selected by the board of directors, it should go to national. And thus ensued multiple years of litigation. It was eventually settled after there were multiple decisions on it. But I do want to warn you that it is in the board's prerogative in dissolution to pick who the successors are, but you can't always be sure until the dissolution is final that that will be respected. And we've recently seen other organizations intervening in these dissolutions to try and grab assets. So I mentioned that to you. Option 5. Option 5 would be a joint venture affiliation whereby A and B contract to work together by contractual affiliation or obligation. There are many of these, but I want to mention one that I think was particularly creative, and that was the Fieldston School for Ethical Culture and the Ethical Culture Society. They were created in the 1890s, and we reaffiliated them in the 1990s. Why? Because the Ethical Culture School, being part of a religious corporation, was not eligible to get a lot of different kinds of 501c3 funding. So we reaffiliated them contractually, but we split off the Ethical Culture School into an education corporation. They still share space, they still share names, they still share intellectual property, but they reaffiliated happily contractually. And there are many examples of those kinds of programs where people do joint ventures or fiscal sponsorships. We're not going to go into detail about those today, but there's a great book by Greg Colvin called Fiscal Sponsorship: 6 Ways to Do It Right, where you can talk about structures for affiliation. And the final thing I want to talk about is option 6, the sale of substantial assets. In New York State, we found where real estate in New York is so valuable that many, particularly religious organizations that may have owned their real estate since the 1850s, 1840s, were being hoodwinked by real estate purchasers who were buying low and flipping high. As a result, the law was changed in New York to require anytime a religious corporation, and now anytime a corporation sells all or substantially all of its assets, that the Attorney General has to assess the fairness of the transaction to the charity because there were so many unfair flips that were happening. One example that I think you might know about is 601 Lexington Avenue. If you've ever been to the Citicorp building, you know that in the bottom of the Citicorp building on Lexington Avenue is St. Peter's Lutheran Church. Citicorp Center, that building with the big slanted top, was built on the site owned by St. Peter's Lutheran Church, a small church with a failing congregation. And they were able to negotiate a huge purchase price for their land, but also that Citicorp would rebuild the church for them inside the base of the Citicorp building. It's been very successful for St. Peter's. They now have a very advanced space. They use it for a lot of things. And that is a case that was very successful. A case that wasn't so successful was the Rose Acco Foundation, which was a facility for elderly Jewish people, and that one spent decades in litigation. So those are 6 options. It's not all of them, but those are the main ones. And I will stop there and let's go to questions, Michael.
Thanks, Victoria. I'm just going to add a couple things. Asha, can you paste in that some stuff about CCNV more broadly? So, folks, do you have a copy of that? Yeah. So just to know that for those of you who are on this webinar is being hosted by the Collaborative Clinic for Nonprofit Viability, which is at this point a 2-university, Howard University and Yale University legal clinic aimed at basically buttressing environmental justice and indigenous organizations in the United States in coming years, ensuring that they stay strong, vital, and are defended against attacks by state and federal entities who may be hostile in this environment. I want to thank Victoria so much for what you said. I think we are having a webinar series here to increase the number of options people have, but we also have direct service. And although Victoria is not super available, we have people of equal stature to Victoria standing by on key different issues that nonprofits face, in addition to directly the ability to do health checks with our students in our clinical setting, both at Howard and at Yale, and increasingly in other parts of the country as well. So thanks everybody for being on. Let's start with questions, and I may pop in with a couple of stories of my own. I've been responsible for 2 nonprofit mergers myself and consulted to a couple of others in the past. I'll say one other thing, which is your funders will often be extremely excited that you're thinking about a merger, or don't throw it out just to excite them, but they tend to be very excited by entrepreneurial thinking about organizational survival and efficiency. So if you feel like I wouldn't float it by them just to see, because they'll always jump and say yes because they like that kind of thinking. So you want to be sure it's something you think is worth doing, and that you've talked to your potential candidates to the organizations you may be merging with first. But once you get down the road where thinking it's a decent idea, you can get a lot of external funding, additional funding, organizational effectiveness funding, often from foundations to support it. And twice now I've had that well supported by where we've had people like Victoria, law firms, and others, and organizational effectiveness experts come in and help us achieve a good merger. There's also pretty good books on this stuff, manuals on how to achieve these mergers that are available through through booksellers that you can get and rehearse some of the scenarios that Victoria did. And this webinar is being recorded and will be available online. And I think we're also probably going to have a transcript and have some of the structures and examples easy to find that Victoria's mentioned. So with that, I'm going to let Asha help us curate the questions that have come in. I know there's at least one so far, but we'd love to welcome others.
Yes, thank you. The first question we got from the audience, which is, what would be considered a deep hole when thinking about tax liabilities?
Well, I have to tell you, employment taxes are treated as money held in trust for the federal government. And so if you set aside money to pay employment taxes and then apply it to your programs, you may see that members of your board of directors are going to find their bank accounts attached by the federal government. And boy, is that a wake-up call. And any deep pocket individual associated with the organization can be liable for those funds. Those funds are very, very special. Not $1 of employment taxes should ever be applied to operational expenses. Those are held in trust for the government.
And Victoria, I think it's safe. Tell me if I'm wrong here, but it's safe to say that is not something you can avoid through a merger or through a dissolution. That
Definitely not.
they will hunt that money down any way they can. Yeah, yeah. Okay,
And
go ahead
sadly,
though.
I've
Otherwise,
had cases where I've had hysterical board members engaging counsel to address it. And the answer is, hey, your board was asleep at the wheel. Your executive was asleep. You guys have to address this. The money has to go back. The penalties have to be paid. And you have to come up with the funding, from whatever means you can. In those cases, the board members had to pay. And then the board members, under the provisions in the bylaws, were able to get funding or refunding from other board members, or
yeah. And
because
I
of
don't think directors' insurance protects them against that either, right?
generally it does not.
Yeah,
Generally, it
yeah.
will not.
So, but there are
Officer
other,
liability insurance, but
yeah,
indemnification provisions. I'm trying not to be too technical, but if the bylaws have indemnification and one director ends up paying that, the other director can look to all of the directors to contribute to that expense.
yeah. But there are other kinds of there's, for example, can you talk about some of the other kinds of overhanging historical debts or obligations that have been effectively or
Yeah,
usefully split out in a merger?
Yeah, well, one thing would be if you had restricted funds and you use the money for an improper purpose. I will tell you that I represented a charity that made grants for nursing to get more nurses into the field of gerontology. And some organizations stopped their gerontology nursing programs or stopped nursing programs. And they just wanted to keep the money. And we said no. The funder demanded that those monies either be restored if they had been misspent, but that they went over to other organizations that still had gerontological nursing. So restricted funds would be one area. Other areas would be your regular creditors. You didn't pay Staples. You didn't pay the company that does the cleaning of your office. You didn't pay your landlord. In those cases, you have to go to the different creditors and try and work out payment deals with those organizations. But you should be thinking about this long before you get into problems with your creditors. But sometimes, if you have a clear list of your liabilities, your merger partner will be willing to take those on, but they may limit their acceptance of liabilities to a set schedule. And they're not going to do it if that schedule is so big that the organization should have been in dissolution because it's no longer a going concern.
Yeah. And also, I mean, there's also in many states, I don't know all, in many states, the survival of your mission trumps the restrictions on grants. Namely, you can say, listen, we know we had a grant restriction, but we're going to go completely out of business unless you forgive, let us spend the money on some other stuff. I know in California, at least, that was something that was allowable in the face of survival. So I guess the point of this isn't to escape to irresponsibly escape liabilities or break the law with respect to creditors or tax payments, but it's about understanding how thinking about mergers can create new degrees of freedom and relieve pressure by thinking creatively about where to assign those liabilities and how to manage them. If you're sitting in the world and doing really effective work, but have an overhang because of what's been happening of various sources, because of what's been happening financially over the last couple of years, or what may happen in the next couple of years. This merger and acquisition framework can help you create more breathing room and more options for how to move forward. Are
I
there other
would
questions that
say
people have?
I just want to mention you can't
Yeah,
unrestrict your restricted gifts yourself. You either have to go back to the donor if the donor still exists to get their permission. There are forms that they use to release restrictions or change the restrictions or release them
yeah,
entirely. And if they're not available in most states, including California and New York, you have to go to the Attorney General typically or to a court and do a cypre or quasi-cypre activity.
Yeah, I would say, Victoria, I'm talking about fairly small. In our case, it was grants in the $100,000 to $200,000 range with no long history of legally in trusts or anything like that. And advice we got from counsel, we definitely spoke to the funders about what was happening, but it's there. It's if the survival of the organization at stake, you especially for a shorter term set of restrictions, there's some flexibility in a lot of states.
Mm-hmm.
Um, other questions from the audience or from attendees? Otherwise, I can talk a little bit more about some of the obstacles that people run into and how to think about them, sort of operationally as well. Do we have any other questions pending, Asha?
No pending questions at this moment, but I will flag if any others come in.
Okay, thanks. Let me say, I think in terms of doing mergers and acquisitions, and Victoria, this has been super informative. So thank you so much for all you've given us so far. I think I ran an organization called Redefining Progress in the mid 2000s. That was at sort of one of the few national sustainability or policy organizations that the United States ever had. And we had a sort of a peer slash sister in Washington, D.C. We were based in Oakland, but we did our work nationally called the Center for Sustainable Economy. And we weren't identical by any means, but we were covering the same beat, so to speak. We were born out of really funder initiatives in the early 2000s who wanted us to sort of think about bringing economics to the table around questions of sustainability and climate change. Believe it or not, until about 2005, it was not well understood that climate change had major economic implications in the United States. And there were two organizations that really held those ideas and proposed the things that eventually became AB 32 in California and the RGGI polluter pay fee structures that now collect over $6 billion a year in revenue from polluters, carbon polluters, climate polluters. But we were very similar, and this stuff was the funders would be getting sort of really scared about climate action. We're talking about like 2002, 2003 era, and they actually stopped funding the economic work. They were just like, we're just going to get, and at the time it was McCain, Lieberman, eventually became Waxman Markey, these bills through, and we're not going to, and we don't to heck with the economic arguments and stuff like that. And we were both facing really hard times, and we had incredible people working for us. And in all fairness, the better analysts, I was running Redefining Progress, the better analysts were the ones in Washington, D.C. I had two great staff people, one named Andrew Horner. I'm spacing on the other ones, but these were real pioneering economists who had spent more than a decade advocating for this kind of stuff, and we didn't want to lose them to the field. And yet the organization itself was really close to folding, and they had a great leader. Again, I forget her name, but there was a woman who was CEO. But functionally, the work was being done by these incredibly brilliant. They were a little nerdy, right? So they couldn't run the organization, but they produced these amazing content and papers and stuff like that. And so we were able to negotiate a way to bring them into the staff and to fold the assets of that organization into Redefining Progress and keep the work alive in the early 2000s. And it did then lead to mechanisms today that generate more than $6 billion a year in revenue in over 14 states from polluters paying for carbon emissions. We haven't made that much progress, unfortunately, since then on that front, but that was an example. So part of what you gain in a merger is you reduce administrative overhead, right? You don't, then assuming you're not super large organizations, you have an HR structure, you have a financial management structure, you have a fundraising structure and software licenses and all those kinds of things that you can really become more efficient by combining forces. And then ideally, there's programmatic synergy. In this case, it was clear that the organization that was in a little bit more trouble than us had actually more human resource, had great assets in the people who could do the work, and bringing them on board was a really important piece of it. Back then, remote work was less common, so one of them ended up moving from the DC area to the Bay Area, and the other one did stay, and we actually kept the office space, some of the office space. So we ended up having a Washington office to boot as a result, which was a real addition to our effectiveness. There was also
How did
brand
you,
confusion.
oh,
Yeah,
I'm
go
sorry.
ahead.
I wanted to know, how did
No,
you combine your boards of directors?
yeah, I don't remember in detail. I think we did bring on a couple. I think with the CEO of the organization that we absorbed went on our board for a bit. and I forget what we did with the rest of them. I think they did have a couple of board members that we kind of coveted that were really, really cool. Our asset was reputation. We were a bit better known, and we had done things with Paul Krugman, who at the time was not yet a columnist for the New York Times. We had a lot of Nobel economists on our side, but we didn't have the really smart analysts that they had who could kind of take that branding and turn it into papers and policies and stuff like that. So we had people, but they weren't as sharp and productive as the ones the other organization had. And we were broader, was we had a broader agenda. But this ended up being one of our signal achievements with what we did with those folks. It also cleared up confusion in the field about the difference between the organizations. It was hard to fundraise, always had been hard to fundraise for a National Sustainability Policy Institute in a country that's the least sustainable country in the world. Highest incarceration rate, highest fossil fuel rate. Funders were like, really? But we got a lot done anyway. Go ahead, Asha. Did you have something you want to add?
Well, we have a couple of audience
Oh, great.
questions.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. So and I see the
Let
audience
me also
questions
let me
we
just say from an environmental justice Let me just say, from an environmental justice perspective, by the way, those same staff people ended up writing the first reports on African Americans and climate, the first reports on labor and climate, the first reports on Latinos and climate, really helped birth the climate justice movement out of that merger as well. Even though and that was something we had in our organization, was a strong environmental justice component. By bringing those economists over who were very sympathetic, we were able to bring rigor and a real launch in those fields. Go ahead, Asha. Sorry.
Yeah, so the questions we have from the audience, I think, touch on similar strains. So I'm going to read all of them, and I think that answers might touch on a couple of them that you might give. So first, what do organizations need to think about in terms of compatible cultures and operations in preparation to merge? And then, can you speak to the context about scenarios for why one would consider a merge and timing considerations? And the last that also kind of goes to preparation and timing for small organizations. What should organizations do to be attractive to potential mergers?
So you should have a strategic plan for your organization, no matter how big or small you are. And in that strategic plan, you should assess your future viability. And if things aren't looking good in a 5-year strategic plan, you should be thinking about what other organizations are in our field that it would make sense for us to talk to about potential combinations. The cultures you look for, well, we had a good discussion of the Nature Conservancy and Rare. Sometimes the work might strategically fit together very well, but maybe the cultures are very different because of the size or the way that the organizations operate. It's very important to know who your peer organizations are and where they're operating and what they're doing, how you differ and how you're alike. In the corporate world, when you have organizations that are very similar and operating on parallel tracks, they're much more likely to combine than they are in the nonprofit world because we all think in the nonprofit world that our way and our people are the best. But you really have to engage in conversations with your peers. And sometimes by just reaching out and meeting and talking, and seeing how you distinguish yourselves or how you could be very synergistic, that is how combinations start. As I mentioned
Yeah.
before, it's hard to say how long it will take, but there usually is a thinking period. There are consultants and others out there. You can find them on the internet. This organization could help you think through, for example, whether a merger or combination would be useful. But you also have to analyze your funding likelihood. Are you going to be able to make it financially in this austere environment? I'll stop there, Michael.
Yeah, no, and then we have to wrap up in a minute. I want to thank you, Victoria, but I want to just say, it is one of the questions is, do we need a lawyer first? No, not necessarily. It can be,
No.
I think you really need to think about along the lines of what Victoria said, alignment, who are your peers? How do you do that? That we're in an era where we're all being encouraged to build bridges, to build broader coalitions, to get over things that have been dividing us so that those people who are trying to fight the tough stuff that's happening right now can work better together. It's very similar. I want to say the private sector has a huge amount of, there's a lot of personalities involved the merger issues in the private sector as well. That the psychology of it is really a lot of it. And the one thing we do have going for us, if we can find it in the not-for-profit sector, is mission. And I would say that profit motive is for some people, especially the very wealthy, less of a reason to give up their power than the mission, right? Which is we're trying to save the world, or we're in this way, and you're trying to save the world in that way. So some of what can drive you to let go of your personal, the ownership that you have to sort of let go of to be able to work more effectively in a merger, can be driven by the mission of your organization. Remembering what you're trying to achieve in the end, finding common ground on that with other nonprofits can be a real way to think about how to be more effective and to survive, to fight another day in this environment. So I want to thank Victoria very much. Remind people you can come to our website at ycej.yale.edu and find the Collaborative Clinic for Nonprofit Viability. We are doing health checks and helping organizations stay viable and having a continuing series of webinars, but we also have personal services for specific organizations that we're having in DC, in the New England area, and around increasingly around the country over the summer and into next year with our partner at Howard University. So thank you, Victoria. Thanks, Asha, our director. And thank you all for sitting in and speaking with us, spending this hour with us. It'll be online, and we look forward to interacting with you in some way in the near future. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.